You're tuned in to the Reality Fred podcast. Food and travel, cool stuff, weird stuff, entertainment, and more. You made the choice to be here, and my friend, you've chosen wisely. Now buckle up, because it's time to get started. It's time for the Reality Fred podcast.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
And welcome back, Reality Fred podcast followers. Tonight, I'm doing a bit of an impromptu podcast recording. It's a podcast that I knew that during the month of November I wanted to record, and I knew I wanted to have it out by the 19th. Wasn't necessarily planning on recording it tonight, but it's just one of those things where the timing felt right, the evening felt right, and so I wanted to go ahead and put this together. Those that know me personally know that I enjoy visiting the town of Gettysburg, that I enjoy Civil War history, and as we grow the podcast, I plan to do a lot more Civil War podcasts down the road, especially more about different topics of Gettysburg. I've already done one in the very beginning about my favorite things to do when visiting, taking vacation to Gettysburg. But I knew coming into November, I wanted to do one about the Gettysburg Address. And today is November 6th, and we're about 13 days away from the anniversary of the day that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, the day of the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg. And I've visited Gettysburg a lot. I do the tours a lot. I have no problem repeating tours, because every time I go, every time I do something, I learn something new, or I learn another person's perspective from another, maybe a different tour guide and so forth. But I think it was last year or the year before, within the past 2 years, one of the really interesting tours that I did there was one of the cemetery. And if you go to Gettysburg, you can do the paid tours, you can do the bus tours. I highly recommend it, especially if it's your first time there. Definitely do a bus tour. From the ones I like are from right out of the visitor center. But there's also other companies that do tours as well. The one I still want to try, there's a group called the History Nerds. Looks like they put together a fun tour. I haven't tried it yet, but it's one that eventually I'd like to do. But Gettysburg will also sponsor free, I don't know if you want to call them tours, but kind of outdoor seminars, workshops, guided walks, whatever you want to call them. And they're always going on, and I definitely suggest that you, if while you're out there, if there's one going on about the cemetery, to definitely do it. Now, if there is not, if you go out there and during the days that you're there, there's no kind of free tour of the cemetery or again, guided walk or anything like that, the one option you do have for sure, if you go to the visitor center, when you go there, as far as tours go, you can either do the bus tour or you can actually basically rent one of their trained field guides. And the way that works, if you do one of their, basically they call it the personal guide, they essentially get in your car and ride around with you, or they'll drive your car, and you can just be a passenger in your own car and they'll drive you around. The important thing to know with that is tip them very well. It's not, let's say cheap. I hate to use the word cheap. It's not inexpensive to get the private guided tour. But it's my understanding that the money that you pay, I don't know if any of that goes to the actual guide at all. So be prepared to give them a decent tip for their time. It's usually about a 2-hour guide. But the nice thing about it is it's completely custom to what you want to explore. So if you're saying, I want to learn more about Day 1 or Culp's Hill or the Battle of Little Round Top, whatever it might be, you tell them what you are specifically interested in, and then that individual will basically put together a custom tour for you on the spot, whatever you want to learn. But if you do take that opportunity, I would definitely recommend asking them if they can take it to the cemetery and talk about the everything behind the cemetery. The story behind it is very fascinating. And if you go to the cemetery, it's beautiful to see. It's definitely a place you want to visit when you're in Gettysburg. But you miss out on a lot by not knowing, how the dedication came to be, the ceremony, the design, who is involved, and things like that. It's not like you just they blinked their eyes one morning and there was the National Cemetery. No, there was a process behind it that kind of had to unravel naturally and things like that, and obviously it leads up to one of the greatest speeches ever in human history, the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. So, because I enjoyed that element of it so much, I knew I wanted to do a podcast, and that leads us to this episode that I'm recording tonight. Now, I specifically wanted to do this episode just off the top of my head, and unlike a lot of other episodes, it's nice about having, directing your own podcast. You can do it however you want. Some episodes I like to do a lot of research, have my facts straight, and kind of go in a very organized, pre-planned path. Other times I like to just speak from memory, or go with the flow. And for some reason, particularly with this podcast, with this episode, I really just wanted to tell a story the way I wanted to do it, without kind of worrying about putting together an outline and all the facts and the dates and everything like that. So, with that said, what I'm basically going to do is kind of tell the story how I want to tell it, based on all of the tours I've done, the books I've read, the documentaries I've watched, that all resonate and kind of point everything towards the cemetery and Lincoln's address. So I'm sure along the way, some of the name, I should get the names right, but some of the small facts, exact dates and things like that, I'm sure maybe I'll get something wrong. But overall, it's the story that I'm more concerned with, and I want to do this in a relaxing way. I didn't want this to be a stressed out podcast. I wanted it to be delivered in a way I would enjoy, because it's a topic that I really enjoy. So let's get started. So obviously you have the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. And I'm not going to make this a podcast about the battle, but I'm just putting at least starting us with the time period of where we're at with the battle. Now, so when it comes to the Gettysburg Address, which we'll, eventually get into the specifics of that, I want to put as much context as I can, because that address, Lincoln's speech that day, while it's only 272 words long, 2 minutes long, there's so much meaning behind it, and there's so much, you can see the thought that Lincoln put into that speech. And now, obviously, the war breaks out in 1861. Not to really get into all the reasons for the battle, but just to jump to the beginning, of course, the war breaks out 1861. Nobody really could have foreseen at the time that this would go on last for years. And, most people thought that it would be over after the first battle, when it wasn't, maybe a few weeks, a few months, and that would be it, and everybody would be going home. So, that's really what most people were thinking. So no one could have ever imagined it dragging out for by the time that the cemetery is being dedicated. We're talking well over 2 years into the war, and it's still not over. And in the consciousness is, how long will this go on, and do we want it to go on? And that's the big thing. So obviously we're in the year 1863. The war's been going on much longer than anybody anticipated. Just the cost of the war, the number of people that have died on both sides by this time, the sacrifices of the people that fought, the sacrifices of the families, the towns, the states, what is still left of the Union, things like that. All the sacrifices. So now you get into 1863, January 1st. Lincoln gives the executive order for the Emancipation Proclamation, essentially freeing, saying that the slaves are free. So we kind of begin the year 1863, 7 months before the actual Battle of Gettysburg, but we begin 1863 with this executive order, this Emancipation Proclamation. So while slavery was always a reason that the war was started, and the reason that the war began, and why it was being fought in 1863 with this, it's not only renewed, but it's honed down to becoming a very specific reason, that this is now specifically a war on freeing men, women, and the children, basically the slave population in the South. It's becoming a war dedicated to that cause. So that idea is bigger than it was even before January 1st, 1863. So it's a very it's a specific purpose now. It is not just about getting the Union back together. That these southern states are rebel states, and we need to preserve the Union and get them back into the Union. It becomes more specific of this cause now with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So fast forward, of course, we have the Battle of Gettysburg, and I'm just going to bypass the whole battle because there's so much to talk about with that, and I look forward to doing that in future podcasts. So as far as the actual battle goes, and what happens there, we're going to just bypass those 3 days and actually just jump right to waking up July 4th, 1863. Now, two aspects really to talk about here is the big one, of course, is the aftermath at the Battle of Gettysburg, and also the realization that while Gettysburg is a victory for the North in terms that it didn't lose the battle,